Hi, welcome to In Sync, the podcast that explores the history and impact of some of your favorite music moments in TV and film. I'm your host, Rachel Brodsky.
And I am also Rachel Brodsky. No, I'm Aviv Rubenstein.
Last week, we dove headfirst into Cruel Intentions and the pivotal final scene featuring Reese Witherspoon, a vintage Jaguar, and the Verve's 1997 hit Bitter Sweet Symphony.
And if you haven't listened to that episode, we suggest you go back and do that right now. The story is wild, and it includes blowing 10% of the movie's budget on this one song, and several lawsuits between the Verve's Richard Ashcroft and the Rolling Stones, which kept nearly 20 years of royalties from the Verve.
Today, however, we're going to be talking to Jordan Ross Schindler, co-creator of Cruel Intentions, the 90s musical, about his love for this film, adapting the movie for stage, and the long-lost pilot for the Cruel Intentions TV reboot starring Sarah Michelle Gellar.
Plus, a little bit more about my favorite sync in Cruel Intentions, Placebo's Every You, Every Me.
All that and more on this sequel episode of In Sync. So real quick, do you want to talk about, I can get into Placebo opening Cruel Intentions.
There are certain kind of Gen Xers that will tell you that The Big Chill has the best soundtrack of any movie. The Big Chill being kind of like a beyond the soundtrack, a mediocre film, mediocre to good. And I think that Cruel Intentions is that for our generation, that the soundtrack lives on far longer than the film itself, and specifically for young Aviv, the opening track of Ever You, Ever Me by Placebo, really connected, hot-wired something in my brain.
Ever You, Ever Me opens with Sebastian driving towards New York City. So the two scenes, the first scene and the last scene, they mirror each other. This song was released in January of 99. It was the third single from Placebo's second album, Without You, I'm Nothing. And this is a really tense and hard-driving track, and it perfectly sets the stage for meeting Sebastian, who is when we meet him, he's a jaded Upper East Side high school senior. He's got a serious womanizing reputation. And as the lyrics perfectly encapsulate his character by saying, there's nothing else to do. My heart's a tart. Your body's rent. But at the same time, the song longs for something real. And Sebastian, we're led to think has will and should be redeemed. And ultimately he does. But we're kind of led to see that there's a deep loneliness central to his womanizing, and he just basically has an emotional void to fill with sex.
This song has a ton of energy and has this kind of this jaded point of view of flailing out for something real and coming up with, sex and substances and everything else. And fun fact, this was my introduction to the band Placebo. It started a decades-long love affair with the band. Placebo is a go-to karaoke band for me because I can do a passable singing impression of their singer, Brian Malco.
That's awesome. He's got a good, nasal
Such
sneer.
A good voice.
Yeah. They've got, I forget what Smith song they covered, but that was a favorite of mine.
Big Mouth Strikes Again.
Yeah.
And they changed Walkman to Discman, and I was like, this is so cool. Yeah, Placebo has a covers record. They sang with Bowie. They're at the risk of doing an entire second episode about Placebo and Every You, Every Me. Brian Molko of Placebo he's openly bisexual, which was kind of a daring thing for a guy to be in a 90s rock band. But it places this glam punk anthem as the perfect opener for the film, whose plot includes Sarah Michelle Gellar gleefully awakening Selma Blair's bisexuality in a kiss that was freeze framed on computer screens across the world.
And awarded at the MTV, Movie Awards.
Deeply remember that.
They kissed again. But to zoom all the way back out, we have a very special guest on the show today. fellow Pennsylvanian Jordan Ross Schindler, co-creator of Cruel Intentions, the 90s musical.
He's here to tell us how the movie changed his life and how he was able to change the course of the Cruel Intentions canon.
I can't wait.
Me neither.
We'll be right back.
And we're back from commercial with a seamless edit where it seems like nothing has changed. Now we are joined with, the audience will never know, we're wearing the same clothes and everything. We're joined by writer, producer, Pennsylvanian Jordan Ross Schindler, co-creator of Cruel Intentions, the musical, the 90s musical, the unofficial.
The 90s musical. Yeah.
Unofficial, official. What's the name? Tell me the name.
So it's Cruel Intentions, the 90s musical. We've had a bunch of different names along the way, but we started very unofficial, and now we are official.
How about that? How the hell did you create a question mark parody so good that it became on par with the original?
We really tried to stay as far away from the word parody as possible. I understand saying it.
Right.
Because, when, especially in Los Angeles at the time, there were a lot of, stage adaptations of movies being, turned into jukebox musicals, kind of guerrilla style. Cruel Intentions, the 90s musical wouldn't exist if I hadn't gone to the Rockwell to see a parody of Scream. And, I was so inspired by that I kind of was like, I want to do something, in the theater world, but I don't even know where to start.
But wait, a parody of a parody though?
Yeah. So in many ways, it was sort of like them making fun of Scream, even though Scream already makes fun of the genre itself.
This is getting into Inception territory for me.
Meta inside of a meta.
Yeah.
So I was a theater kid in high school. Aviv and I went to the same high school. You, Council Rock South. You're 2 years above me? 2 years above me?
I graduated in 2004 because I'm old.
Okay.
And Jordan.
We can be old together. That's when I graduated.
2006 because Jordan's a youngster.
We're all old.
Yeah.
2 years. It's young. 2 years younger. So I was a theater kid in high school. I was in choir, and I think there was a moment I thought oh yeah, you're going to be an actor. This is going to be great. And then I got to college, and I sort of was around some of the theater kids in the theater department at Temple University. And I realized, that they just all wanted it so much more than I did. I wasn't a performer. And at that point, I was very committed to being a writer, specifically a TV writer. I moved to LA, and I, was working, variety of jobs to kind of pay the rent, which was significantly cheaper back in 2011. And I ended up getting a job at a summer camp in LA where I returned to my Philly roots, because every summer, summer break, I would work at a summer camp. And, this was the one thing I knew I could do. And I was, just working with 15 to 20 first graders and, out, swimming and, playing sports and, and it was a great way to make some money and not have to hate every second of the job. And one of my campers' parents was a TV exec. And I remember she was like, do you want to be a teacher? And I was like, no, I don't. I want to write for television. She was like, well, send me your resume and, I'll see what I can do. And, a lot of people say that in Los Angeles.
A lot of overpromising, a lot of under-delivering.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
And you don't get your hopes up. The following October, I was really getting ready, I think, to move back to PA after 3 years of trying to, make it as a writer. I got a phone call and she was like, do you have, can you go sit down with Dan Dworkin and Jay Beatty? They were a writing team that had just had their first show greenlit at this network, the El Rey Network, which is owned by Robert Rodriguez. And it was my first TV gig. I had no idea how to be a showrunner's assistant. I didn't know what that entailed. I was just so excited to have a pinky toe in the door, and you sort of learn as you go. Where Cruel Intentions came from is when I got the showrunner's assistant job, I was pretty confident that I was set for 4 to 5 years. I was like, they love the show. It's a new network. Eventually, I'll get promoted to staff writer. I'll have my first episode. I could visualize it. They renewed us for a second season. I took it upon myself to throw a season 2 renewal party at a club in Hollywood for like the cast and the crew. And then maybe like a week or two later, they canceled it after already renewing it, which apparently happens more often than you think, which I wasn't aware of at the time. And in that moment, I was sort of realizing, like, what am I going to do now? I didn't have a resume outside of the opportunities that I had created for myself, which were short films. You know, I had more samples than I knew what to do with, but I had no representation. And I remember talking to Evan Bleiweiss, who was one of the writers on the show. I just said, I was like, you know, how do you break in? Tell me the tricks. Like, what is it? The piece of advice that he gave me was, it was so simple, but it was just do something that's going to make you stand out. Have something on your resume that's going to make you stand out among, you know, a pretty crowded field. There's so many writers. Everybody has a story to tell. You know, and my resume was like, I moved from Philly. I worked in radio. Like, I didn't really have anything on there that, you know, separated me from, I think, all the other writers that I knew that were in the assistant game trying to break in. And I went to this venue called the Rockwell Table and Stage, and I had seen a bunch of shows there. There's the For the Record crew. They would take one director and do a musical of like 4 or 5 of his movies. And they did Baz Luhrmann. They did Robert Zemeckis. I think they did Scorsese. So I had seen a lot of these kind of jukebox musicals kind of, you know, mashed up with popular movies. And then I went to go see Scream. And I remember leaving there being the most inspired I had been in a very long time. I love the 90s. I'm very unapologetic about my love for that decade. I just went home and I was like, okay, I'm gonna write a musical. It was like I'm gonna write a musical. I had no idea what it should look like, the format. Like, I really had no idea. And I went home, and it just so happened that Cruel Intentions, the edited for TV version, was on. And I sat down. I hadn't seen it in a long time. I just was instantly reminded why I love this movie. Yes, it's sexy. Yes, it's funny. But it really does sort of take you on a journey from the Upper East Side, you know, these sort of rich teens getting away with murder, not literal murder, but obviously, like, you know, there was like a no parenting household, and really getting to watch Sebastian change as he falls in love with Annette. And then, of course, you know, Sarah Michelle Gellar, I was a huge Buffy fan.
Same here.
Yeah, I mean, you know, getting to see her in a role that was such the opposite of Buffy really always stuck with me. I mean, of course, I think I saw Cruel Intentions at an age where I was too young to understand any of it. Like, it was like that naughty sleepover movie that you weren't supposed to be watching. I was probably 12 when I saw it for the first time. But I just remembered how much I loved it. It lent itself to the stage so well, probably because, you know, Roger Kumble, the writer-director, came from a theater background. So there's this theatrical quality to it. Of course, Dangerous Liaisons, the source material, has been adapted and readapted many times. So there's something universal about the story. We just kind of like went from there. So I had this big idea that I didn't know what to do with it. I put a draft together. So many songs did not make the cut. I knew I wanted to use massive chunks of the soundtrack. The one thing about jukebox musicals is that these songs are not written for the story. So it was really important to me to find songs that would drive the narrative forward. And now, like all these years later, I think it's so cool and interesting to go and see the show and see how the songs have sort of been absorbed by the story. And I've had people come up to me and be like, you know, they were watching the movie and expecting them to break into song, or were like they didn't hear, you know, Catherine sings I'm the Only One by Melissa Etheridge in Act 1. And like, it's like one of the first scenes right out the gate. And I think it's so amazing that we were able to find songs that really did kind of elevate the material, as opposed to just feel like we were trying to like get the audience's attention.
Yeah, we were going back and forth initially when it came to Cruel Intentions, because as we mentioned earlier in the show, people in their 30s, like people who saw, or 40s or older, just like saw, when they saw the movie when it first came out, we would automatically think later of the song Colorblind, that like to accompany this movie as like the premiere needle drop. But right. I think it sounds like that needle has moved, and Bitter Sweet Symphony, that needle drop is more likely it has stood the test of time, to a greater extent than colorblind. No shade to colorblind.
I will throw a ton of shade to colorblind.
Maybe a little shade. I don't know. I'm trying to keep it kind.
Well, that wasn't even, I don't think Roger even was going to use colorblind at first, whereas I think Lindsay Rosen's the co-creator of the musical with me. And I remember when we were getting ready to go off Broadway to New York, and we were, working with Eva Price, our incredible producer, and Janet Rich, who handled all of our music clearances. I was like, what are we going to do if we don't get Bitter Sweet Symphony or Colorblind? Or, we ended up getting the rights to everything except 2 songs that were originally in the show. We had no trouble getting the rights to Bitter Sweet Symphony.
I was going to ask how difficult, because for the film it was incredibly difficult to get Bitter Sweet Symphony.
Sometimes I think as any writer who will sit with you and tell you if they're writing with a specific song in mind, it becomes very hard to find an alternate. And Roger wrote that sequence to this song. They tried a bunch of songs and ultimately decided that it was worth the price tag to go and get this song. And when we were doing the musical, I was like, you can't do Cruel Intentions, the musical, without Bitter Sweet Symphony. So I was relieved. It was like a sigh of relief when we got the email that said it's cleared, we're good. And I think now the rights have reverted back to Richard Ashcroft.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, they were still with the Rolling Stones.
Right.
So it was not an easy song to get a hold of for the movie. And of course, when the musical went legit, Lindsay and I had Colorblind and Bitter Sweet Symphony were the 2 songs I think that we had the most concern about.
The other really interesting thing is, and we mentioned this in the kind of the first segment of the show, is it may have cost $1 million to get this song for the movie, but I think that $1 million was paid back in the popular, I think that movie was at least $1 million more popular thanks to its use of Bitter Sweet Symphony. And I want to know if you think the same thing about the show.
I definitely think we probably would have gotten some shit for doing Cruel Intentions without Bitter Sweet Symphony. I just don't think it's possible. There's an episode of Riverdale in season 2 where Veronica sings Bitter Sweet Symphony with the Pussycats. And while they're trying to decide which song to sing, Veronica says, do you know Bitter Sweet Symphony from Cruel Intentions? It's not like Bitter Sweet Symphony by the Verve. It's not Bitter Sweet Symphony, that samples the Rolling Stones. It's from Cruel Intentions. That moment of Catherine being exposed on the steps of Manchester Prep. It all wraps up into this beautiful epic ending with her, that single tear dropping down her cheek, with the car driving off into the distance. I think people expect it. And in the musical, we do sample a little bit of Bitter Sweet Symphony right off the top so people know that it's coming. Mm-hmm. And we get to use the song in a slightly different way than the movie uses it because we're tying up storylines with it. Whereas at the end of the movie, you have Catherine's However Dark the Cloud eulogy, and then it's just the song for the rest of the movie to underscore these major moments. So there was never a version of the show that didn't have the song in it. The show always opened with Every You Every Me, like the movie does, by Placebo. Mm-hmm. And it always ended with Bitter Sweet Symphony, and Colorblind was always there in the middle for the escalator scene, although we've yet to get a real escalator for the show, unfortunately. One day, maybe. We've really tried to sort of mix the best of the 90s in with, the most iconic songs from that soundtrack. We also use Love Fool by the Cardigans,
nice,
which has a very small appearance in the movie during the pool scene. And we decided to sort of use that to our advantage. So we even use one song that isn't on the soundtrack, but is actually featured in the movie.
I just want to say I'm fascinated that ultimately Cruel Intentions was the movie that A, was on TV, but B, the movie that you wanted to really run with to turn into a jukebox musical. And I say this as someone without an over familiarity with the theater world, although I did go to a very theater heavy college as well. I was not a theater major. I just observed the craft rather than participate. But from my vantage point, it seems like Cruel Intentions was so self-serious. Yes, it had funny moments, but it was very dark. It was not She's All That. It was not
No.
Other movies with Bets, teenage Bets at the 10
Fucking
Things I Hate
Bets.
About You. Fucking Bet.
What'd she say? I'm a bet. Am I a fucking bet?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Written
it was
by
not
M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah.
I just found that out recently as like a ghostwriter, right?
Yeah, he ghost wrote She's All
Mhm.
That, which is incredible work.
And there were a lot of teen comedies in the late 90s, maybe I guess early 2000s. You could also say that they were mostly rated PG-13. They were not as overtly sexual. And I wonder, like, when you wrote your proposal, when you put it all together, did anyone push back and say this will never work, or was it mostly this is just so crazy it might work?
The whole thing was like a real lightning in the bottle experience, and I really have to sort of pay it forward to Lindsay Rosen, who co-created this with me and directed the show. I remember we sat down, we went to Arts Deli in Studio City together, and that's where we sort of sat down and met for the first time. And I knew I didn't want to direct the show. I knew that I didn't have enough experience to put a show up on its feet. And our mutual friend, Jonah Platt, linked us up, and we really built it up from the ground together. You know, she had a vision for it in a way that allowed me to focus on the music and the story we were telling. And we sort of really took what was kind of like an unpolished idea. Although, I mean, I had a script. It was, I'll admit, like, the first draft was a mess. But together, we were able to create something that I think is a love letter to the movie. There were definitely some people that in the beginning didn't think it was going to work or sell, or that people were going to come. But we only had 3 dates on the calendar right out the gate, and they were conception performances. So we didn't have an intermission. A bunch of the songs that are in the show now weren't in the show at all. And we really had no tech. So it was just like house lights, basic sound mixing, a few sound effects that I'm pretty sure I was running from the tech booth. Wore many hats during the first run of the show. I remember, someone at the venue was like, yeah, this is never going to work. We were sold out before we even did the first show. We were oversold. Like, there were seats of people were literally sitting in seats that were like up against the wall. So there were definitely more people in the venue than was legally allowed. That night that we opened for the first time, it was February of 2015. The venue came and said, like, how would you like to do April? And then April turned into May, and May turned into June, and June turned into July. Mind you, this entire time, we did not have the rights to the movie. When we opened the show, we got an email that Roger Cumble was coming, and he was coming with Neil Moritz, the producer, and with their lawyer. And I remember I was like, who's like a friend of theirs. And I remember I was like standing with Lindsay, and I was like, well, this has been fun while it lasted, guys. We did 3 nights, but Roger was so gracious. I could just tell that he was having such an amazing time. And after that, he became our biggest champion. And now he's actually co-creator of the musical. And, he was with us in New York for a bit before we opened. We got to know him. I learned so much from him.
There's something very Waiting for Guffman about this story, by the way. Like, you're waiting for the person. I mean, not that you knew he was definitely coming, but it sounds like Cumble's involvement is kind of what brought you to level up, and then you go to Broadway, and he's your Guffman.
Well, he definitely. I mean, so there was the 3 female leads came to see the show together in May of 2015. They came with Roger and his wife for his birthday. I still remember. I will never forget when Lindsay called me to tell me that she had just gotten an email from Sarah saying that Sarah had already seen the show. Sarah came earlier in the run, and she was like, I'd love to come back with Reese and Selma. And Lindsay had to pull over and be like, is this real? Is this a real email that I just received? And I was at work, and I was like, no way. Oh my God. There was a moment before the ladies came that Lindsay and I looked at each other, and we sort of knew that there was something here. I don't think we ever really knew that it was going to become the biggest gift I could have ever hoped for. I thought this was going to be like a small thing I put on my resume and, maybe moved on and did some other things. We went from the Rockwell to doing like a small pop-up in Hollywood, and then we went off Broadway, and there's been a tour, and it went to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and we just finished our first ever tour in Australia, and they loved it. It was like, it's been such a wild ride. Sometimes it doesn't feel real because we were really all just theater lovers and music lovers and 90s lovers, just like kind of like hopping into the trenches to kind of put up this sort of guerrilla show together. There was a lot of theater magic happening. And I think once people saw it and they realized it had all of these things working for it, you didn't have to know Cruel Intentions to come and love the musical. You could just know the music, and people were drinking and singing along. As Entertainment Weekly, I think, said, it was like the ultimate 90s night out.
I love that point, that it sort of stands on its own apart from the movie even. And
Right.
Because even if you didn't see the movie, you still likely, depending on your age, witness the 90s and listen to the radio.
Speaking as someone who has gone to see some of these parodies at the Rock, I'm not lumping Cruel Intentions in with the other parodies at the Rockwell. It seems as though Cruel Intentions is never winking at the audience to say, like, we know that we're being silly. We know that this is kind of a shitty movie. Like the Scream one very clearly does, and the Jurassic Park one does that I saw. And I feel like that is the key to this show. One of the keys to this show's success is it comes from a deep place of love, and you're not ever making fun of the thing that you love.
I'm going to quote Lindsay again. She once said, when we were, I think it was after a show at one night, she was like, it's easy to say that you don't like something, right? Like you can easily write something off, but it's much harder to like stand proud and profess that you love something completely. We just love this movie because there already is this comedy element to the film, mostly, in the role of Cecile, who plays, the sort of comedic relief. And Selma does that, it's so incredible that we didn't feel like we needed to, wink at the audience or to poke fun at the material. We thought that there was a really great emotional roller coaster, that kind of, runs through the heart of the movie. And, act one is sort of where we, set up the bet. And with the music choices, that's sort of where you're getting some of the laughs from the audience. Like when you hear the opening chords of Genie in a Bottle, we always got a laugh from the audience. We used to have I Want It That Way by the Backstreet Boys in the show. It's no longer in the show, but whenever those opening chords, that those first lyrics would come out, you would get a response from the audience. So we didn't feel like we needed that extra parody element to make people enjoy the show. And by the time you get to act two, we start, with Cecile and Catherine, after Sebastian goes down on her and, she's like struggling with these feelings and, isn't really sure what happened. And she sings The Sign by Ace of Base when Catherine tells her that she had an orgasm for the first time. And so we're getting humor in those moments. And I think it allowed us to have the more emotional moments and have the audience go there with us, so that even if you might laugh a little bit when you hear the opening chords of Foolish Games, which Annette sings, towards the end of Act 2, the emotion of the performance in the scene, we play it straight because we've sort of earned that throughout the show. Of course, there are moments, there are nights where the audience is rowdier than usual, had a few more drinks than usual, singing along and stuff like that, which we love. But I think for the most part, I didn't want to write a parody. I don't think the movie needed a parody. I think the movie could be a stage musical with all of its, themes that go all the way back to Dangerous Liaisons, that we could do that straight up without having to, to wink at the audience, like Aviv said.
Thanks so much for listening, and thanks again to Jordan Ross Schindler for sitting down and talking to us. Hopefully we get to see the Cruel Intentions musical on stage again someday.
Yeah, I think if we've learned anything about Cruel Intentions, the franchise, it's that it's never over.
It's never over. There's always a new TV movie to be seen.
thank you again for listening to this bittersweet episode of In Sync.
And like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, leave a rating and review, all the stuff that everyone tells you at the end of podcasts. And tune in next week when we talk about another needle drop that makes your 90s heart flutter. So until next time, I'm Aviv Rubenstein.
I'm Rachel Brodsky.
Saying, I can change.